She is seated at a desk made of chrome and smoked glass, and the light from the Venetian blinds falls across her in even horizontal bars, the way it always does in the photograph you are picturing right now. Her hair is set in two soft rolls that curve away from her face and hold their shape without a single strand out of place. Her lipstick is a deep, matte red, the kind that leaves a clean edge and does not smudge no matter how long the afternoon runs. Her pencil skirt is charcoal wool, cut just below the knee, and it sits against the chair with a precision that suggests she has practiced sitting in it. A man is standing near the window, one hand in his pocket, speaking at a pace that would be difficult for most people to follow. He is dictating a letter. She is not writing words. She is writing the shorthand symbols of the Greek system, small curved marks that flow across the stenopad in a single unbroken line, translating his sentences into a private alphabet at the exact speed he is speaking them, without asking him to slow down, without asking him to repeat himself, without her expression changing at all. This is the year 1962. This is the image the era wanted you to have. It is on the cover of a business magazine. It is the recruitment poster outside the Secretarial College. It is the illustration in the Saturday Evening Post, showing a young woman glancing up at her boss with an expression of bright, capable attentiveness. Her desk clean, her posture perfect, her presence in the room as polished and untroubled as the chrome trim on the desk in front of her. It smells, in this office, like fresh coffee and cigarette smoke, and the particular chemical sweetness of hairspray. Holding those two rolls in place since 6 that morning, the carpet is thick enough to absorb footsteps. The window looks out over a city skyline that is still being built taller every year, cranes visible in the distance, the whole scene humming with the specific optimism of a country that believes its best years are still ahead of it. She finishes the dictation. She reads back 2 lines to confirm she has them correctly. Her voice is calm. Her hands are steady. She sets the pencil down at a precise angle against the edge of the pad, and for one moment she is exactly the woman the magazine wanted her to be. Notice, too, what this particular office does not contain. There is no second desk crowded up against hers, no identical woman typing 18 inches to her left, no third and fourth and fifth woman beyond that. There is one desk, one window, one man dictating at a reasonable, considerate pace, pausing when she asks him to, in a room quiet enough that the only sound is his voice and the occasional soft scratch of her pencil against paper. This is, in the most literal sense, a job for one. It is the rarest possible version of secretarial work in 1962, available to perhaps one woman in every several dozen who trained for exactly this career. And it is the version the era chose, almost exclusively, to put on film and in print because it photographed beautifully and because it flattered everyone in the frame. Wand, the executive who appeared thoughtful and important. The woman who appeared capable and serene. The whole tableau glowing with the specific, manufactured calm of an advertisement. Every woman who trained at a business college in this decade knew about this room, knew it existed somewhere in the building she hoped to work in, and knew with equal certainty that the overwhelming likelihood was that she would never see the inside of it herself. It was the destination held up to every new graduate as the reward for sufficient speed, sufficient accuracy, sufficient patience. A single private office positioned at the top of a ladder that only a small handful of women, out of every class of dozens. That moment is real. It happened, in one form or another, in offices across the country. But it is a single frame taken from a much longer reel, and the rest of that reel was never printed never illustrated, never put on the cover of anything. What you are looking at right now is a masterpiece of concealment. One carefully composed image standing in for a job that had almost nothing else in common with it. And tonight, we are going to look at the rest of the reel. This is 1962, and the American office is in the middle of its own kind of boom. Corporations are growing faster than they have ever grown before. Insurance companies, banks, manufacturers, and the new sprawling federal agencies are all generating an amount of paperwork that no one 20 years earlier would have thought possible. Every one of those letters, every policy, every internal memo and shareholder report and legal brief has to pass through a human hand before it becomes a finished document. And the hands doing that work belong, almost without exception, to women. There is a fascination right now, decades later, with the aesthetic of this particular moment in American office life. You have seen it. The tailored suits, the cocktail hour at 4 in the afternoon, the corner office with the view, the confident men and the composed women who orbit them. An entire television era was built around the glamour of it, and the glamour was not invented from nothing. It was real for the small number of people at the top of the building. What this video is about is not the top of the building. It is the floor below it, and the floor below that, where the actual output of the American corporation was produced by rows of women sitting in front of manual typewriters for 8 hours a day, striking metal keys with enough physical force to leave marks on their fingertips, working under a level of noise and surveillance and precision pressure that the magazine cover never once acknowledged existed. By the early 1960s, roughly 1 in 3 American women in the paid workforce held some form of clerical position, and the overwhelming majority of them worked not in the private, single-desk arrangement of the opening image, but in exactly the kind of large, shared, closely supervised pool this video is about to spend the next 2 hours inside. The private secretary answering to a single executive was the visible exception, romanticized precisely because she was rare. The typing pool, loud, crowded, anonymous, was the actual, statistical norm, the room where most women who trained for this career actually spent their working lives, and it left almost no trace in the popular memory of the era at all. This is that room. Not a polite account of it, an honest one. Before we go further, if this kind of honest history is something you value, if you prefer the real version of the past to the polished one, take a moment to subscribe. It helps us keep making these. And if you would like to, tell me in the comments whether anyone in your family ever worked in an office like this one. I read every comment, and I would love to know. Let us begin where the myth ends and the noise begins. With a woman named Carol. Her name for tonight is Carol Whitfield. She is 24 years old. She has worked in the typing pool of the Continental Mutual Insurance Company for 6 years, since she finished business school at 18, with a certification in typing and a working knowledge of Greg's shorthand that she can still, if pressed, use to take dictation faster than most of the men in the building can speak. She sits at the 3rd desk in row C, one of 9 rows of identical grey metal desks that fill the 4th floor of the Continental Mutual building, a room that holds, on a normal day, somewhere around 50 typists. Carol has been at that same desk, in that same row, for 4 years. She was moved there after her 2nd year, a promotion of sorts, because row C handles the underwriting correspondence, which is considered more demanding work than the general claims typing in row A, and because Carol's accuracy rate, tracked weekly by the floor supervisor, has consistently ranked among the highest in the pool. She is not tall. She stands perhaps 5 feet 4 inches, and she is thin in the way that a great many women of this era are thin, not from any deliberate effort, but from the simple mathematics of a physically demanding job, a modest grocery budget, and a body that burns through both without complaint. Her hands are her most distinctive feature, if anyone ever thought to look closely at them, which almost no one does. The pads of her fingers have hardened slightly over 6 years of striking keys, and there is a small, permanent callus on the side of her right middle finger, worn there by the edge of the shift key, which she presses roughly 4,000 times on an average day. She keeps 2 things in the bottom drawer of her desk that no one else knows about. The first is a small paper bag of peppermint candies, which she allows herself one of, and only one, 3 o'clock every afternoon, when the fatigue of the day reaches the point where her accuracy begins to slip and she needs something, anything, to reset her concentration for the final 2 hours. The second is a small photograph of her mother, taken outside the house Carol grew up in, clipped to the inside panel of the drawer, where it cannot be seen unless the drawer is fully open. She looks at it sometimes, quickly, when the floor supervisor is at the far end of the room. Carol lives 3 blocks from the elevated train in a 1-bedroom apartment she shares with Peggy Doyle, who works 2 rows over in row A and has been Carol's closest friend since their first week at Continental Mutual. They split the rent, the electric bill, and, more often than either of them would like to admit out loud, a single tin of coffee that has to stretch further than it was ever designed to stretch. Carol's mother had wanted something different for her, in the vague, hopeful way mothers of that generation often did, though neither of them could have said precisely what the something different might have looked like. There had been talk, briefly, when Carol was 17, of a nursing program, a respectable path with a clearer sense of purpose attached to it, but the business school certificate took 8 months instead of 3 years, cost considerably less, and put Carol into a paycheck almost immediately. And the household math of the Whitfield family in those years left very little room for anything but the fastest, most certain route to steady income. Carol does not resent the decision. She has told Peggy more than once over the small kitchen table in their apartment that she is good at this work, truly good at it, faster and more accurate than most of the women who trained alongside her, and there is a real satisfaction in that competence even on the days when the job itself asks more of her than she particularly wants to give. Carol is engaged. His name is Walter, and he came home from his service posting 2 years ago and now works as a junior accountant at a firm 11 blocks from Continental Mutual, close enough that they occasionally meet for lunch on a Friday when both of their schedules allow it, which is not often, because lunch on the 4th floor is timed the same way everything else on the 4th floor is timed. The wedding is planned for the following spring. Carol has been putting a portion of every paycheck into an envelope in her top dresser drawer since the engagement, and she knows, to the dollar, exactly how much is in it and exactly how many more paychecks it will take to reach the number she has decided she needs. This is a Tuesday morning in October 1962. Carol left the apartment at 7:15, rode the elevated train for 18 minutes standing the entire way because the morning cars are too full for anyone to sit, and walked the 4 blocks from the station to the Continental Mutual building against a wind that threatened, twice, to undo the careful set of her hair. She arrived at her desk at 7:52, 8 minutes before the required start time, because arriving at exactly 8 o'clock is considered, by the floor supervisor, to already be running late. The lobby of the Continental Mutual building is, itself, a kind of small performance of the company's ambitions. Marble floors, brass elevator doors polished each morning before the first employees arrive. A directory board listing departments Carol has worked near for 6 years without ever once setting foot inside most of them. She takes the elevator to the 4th floor, along with a dozen or so other women arriving at roughly the same time, a brief, familiar ride, during which almost no one speaks beyond a quiet good morning, everyone already beginning, in some private way, to gather themselves for the day ahead. In front of her sits a stack of dictation transcripts from the underwriting department, 11 letters that need to be typed today, each one requiring an original and 3 carbon copies, each one needing to be completed without a single error that cannot be corrected before the carbon layers are separated. The building around her is quiet for one more moment. Then, somewhere down the row, a typewriter carriage slides and locks. Another follows it. And then another and another, until the entire 4th floor begins to fill with a sound that will not stop, not really, for the next 8 hours. Carol rolls a sheet of paper and 3 carbons into her machine, squares the edges with 2 quick taps against the desk, and begins. If you picture a 1960s office, you probably picture something quiet. Hush of productivity. The soft, satisfying click of a typewriter key, maybe 2 or 3 of them going at once in a pleasant, unhurried rhythm, the kind of sound a film uses to suggest competence, without actually asking the audience to feel anything uncomfortable about it. The 4th floor of the Continental Mutual building does not sound like that. It sounds like weather. The room itself is enormous, roughly the size of a basketball court, with a low, tiled ceiling and fluorescent lighting that runs in continuous strips down every aisle. There are no partitions. There are no walls between desks, no plants, no decoration of any kind beyond a company calendar, mounted near the supervisor's station, and a single American flag in the far corner. The desks are arranged in 9 rows of 54 desks in total, each one identical, each one positioned exactly 2 feet from the desk in front of it, and exactly 3 feet from the desk beside it. A spacing determined not by comfort, but by a floor plan drawn up by an efficiency consultant, whose entire job was to calculate the maximum number of typists who could physically occupy that square footage while still having enough room to pull out their chairs. That consultant's original report still exists somewhere in the building's administrative files, though Carol has never seen it and would have no reason to. It would describe, in the clipped technical language of the discipline, an optimal desk density calculated in square feet per employee, a walking path width calculated to the inch, a recommended ceiling material chosen for cost and cleaning efficiency, only output per square foot per dollar, with no line item anywhere in the calculation for what any of it would sound like or feel like or cost the 50 women who would spend their working lives inside the room it produced. Now, think about what happens when 50 of those desks are occupied at once, and every person in every chair is striking a manual typewriter with the force required to make an impression through an original sheet and 3 layers of carbon paper. A single manual typewriter key, struck at typing speed, produces a sharp metallic report, a sound closer to a small hammer hitting a nail than to anything you would call a click. Multiply that single strike by the average speed of a trained typist, somewhere between 60 and 80 words per minute, which works out to roughly 300 to 400 individual key strikes every minute for that one typist. Now, multiply that by 50 typists, all working at roughly the same pace, all striking their own 300 to 400 keys per minute, largely, but not perfectly, in sync with each other. The result is not a rhythm. It is closer to a continuous, layered hailstorm, an unbroken wall of metal, striking metal, that does not pause, does not soften, and does not stop, except for the brief silences when carriages are returned, when paper is changed, when the whole floor pauses for a fraction of a second between one flurry of letters. Underneath that constant clatter sits a second layer of sound. The mechanical slide and snap of carriage return levers being thrown, one after another, all across the room, at the end of every single line, by every single typist, dozens of times a minute. A new girl started in Row D 3 weeks ago, fresh out of the same business school Carol attended 6 years earlier. And Carol watched her go through the same reaction every new hire goes through on her first morning in the pool, a visible flinch at the initial wall of sound when the floor fills. A wide-eyed look toward the nearest familiar face that Carol has learned to answer. With a small, reassuring nod, the wordless communication, "Great, if you get used to it," more or less, passed silently between an experienced typist and a frightened new one across the width of an aisle. By the end of that first week, the new girl's flinch had already begun to fade, replaced by the same tight jaw and creeping shoulders that mark every experienced typist on the floor. The body's own quiet adaptation to a sound it has no real choice but to tolerate. Carol has worked in this room for 6 years, and she still notices the sound when she first sits down each morning, a wall of noise that rises the moment the floor fills and does not meaningfully lower again until the lunch bell. By mid-morning, she has stopped consciously hearing it, the way you stop consciously hearing a fan running in another room. But her body has not stopped responding to it. Her jaw tightens without her noticing. Her shoulders creep upward toward her ears. And by the end of most days, there is a faint, high ringing in her ears that persists through the train ride home and does not fully fade until she has been sitting in the quiet of her own apartment for an hour or more. This is not a detail most people know, and it changes the picture considerably. Modern workplace noise studies conducted decades later, once occupational health became a subject that companies were legally required to take seriously, established that sustained exposure to noise above roughly 85 decibels causes measurable hearing damage over time, and that sustained exposure above 90 causes it faster. A large open room filled with dozens of manual typewriters, all striking simultaneously, regularly measured in the high 80s and low 90s, on the rare occasions anyone thought to bring in equipment and check. Nobody checked it in 1962. There was no occupational safety agency requiring hearing protection for clerical workers because the entire category of clerical work was not considered by anyone with the authority to regulate it to be dangerous in any physical sense. It was paperwork. It was women sitting at desks. The idea that it might be doing measurable, cumulative harm to the bodies producing that paperwork was not a question the era thought to ask, and the women living inside the answer had no framework, no vocabulary, and no authority to ask it themselves. The architecture reinforced the sound rather than absorbing it. The tile ceiling, chosen for its low cost and easy cleaning, reflected noise instead of dampening it. The lack of partitions, chosen to make supervision easier, meant every typewriter strike traveled unobstructed across the entire floor, adding to the total volume rather than being contained to a single desk. Every design decision that made the room more efficient to manage also made it a more effective machine for producing continuous, punishing sound, and none of those decisions were made with the hearing or comfort of the 50 women who would spend 8 hours a day inside that sound in mind. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from working inside constant noise, separate from the exhaustion of the work itself. The mind spends a portion of its available energy simply filtering, simply managing the fact of the sound, even when it is not consciously listening to it. By early afternoon, Carol's concentration has a texture to it that she has never found the words to describe to anyone outside the pool. A kind of static that sits behind every task. that makes the difference between typing at her normal speed and typing at her normal speed while also holding back a headache that has been building since roughly 10 in the morning. And critically, every woman on that floor is managing the exact same thing at the exact same time, in total silence about it, because there is no one to tell. The supervisor does not experience the noise the same way, positioned as she is near the front of the room where the sound disperses slightly before reaching her. The executives upstairs never set foot on the 4th floor long enough to notice it at all. The noise belongs entirely to the women producing it, absorbed into their bodies, one shift at a time, and it leaves the building with them every evening, ringing quietly in 50 pairs of ears on 50 separate train rides home. The noise had its own daily rhythm, one that every woman on the floor learned to read the way a farmer learns to read weather. The morning began relatively gentle. The first hour, a scattered patchwork of individual typewriters, starting up at slightly different times as women arrived, settled in, and began the day's first letters. By 9, the floor had reached what Carol thought of privately as full weather. Every desk occupied, every machine running at pace, the sound settling into the continuous roar that would define the rest of the morning. It held there, largely unbroken, till the lunch bell, when 50 typewriters fell silent within the same handful of seconds, an abruptness that always left a strange, ringing quiet behind it, the kind of silence that feels louder than the noise it replaced simply because the ear is no longer braced for anything. The afternoon brought a second wave, often heavier than the morning, because the mail deadline for outgoing correspondence sat at 4:30, which meant the final 90 minutes of most days carried an added layer of urgency on top of the ordinary noise. Typists pushing to finish letters that absolutely had to leave the building before the mailroom's final collection. Carol has learned to recognize this specific quality of sound, faster, slightly less even, carrying an undertone of hurry that the steadier mid-morning clatter never had, and her own hands respond to it without her needing to consciously decide to speed up, the whole room accelerating together. Simply absorbed collectively from the shared pressure of the same deadline. Every so often, a single machine somewhere on the floor jams a type bar, catching against its neighbor mid-stroke, and the sudden absence of that one typewriter's contribution to the overall wall of sound registers, oddly, as more noticeable than its presence ever was. A small gap in the weather that every experienced typist within earshot half-consciously clocks before returning her attention to her own page. The woman at the jam machine works quickly to free the caught type bars, gently walking them back into place with a fingertip, because a jam costs her precious seconds against her own daily word count. And the room around her continues at full volume, indifferent. The storm simply rolling on without pausing for the single voice that briefly dropped out of it. There is no meaningful comparison in a modern office to what 50 machines like this sounded like from inside the room, hour after hour. But there is a comparison worth offering anyway. Stand next to a working construction site for 8 hours without ear protection, and you begin to approach it. The difference is that a construction worker, by the time protections were finally introduced for that kind of labor, was recognized by law and by medicine as working in a hazardous sound environment. The typing pool never received that recognition, not because the sound was any less real, but because the people producing it were never categorized by the people with the power to categorize such things as workers whose bodies were worth protecting from it. This was not an office in the sense that a modern person understands the word. It was a production floor. It manufactured letters and policies and reports the way a factory floor manufactures parts, on a schedule, at volume, under a supervisor's eye, with the same disregard for the physical toll on the bodies doing the work. The only difference was that this factory floor wore lipstick and called itself clerical. Now, the machine itself. Because the machine is where the myth of light, delicate, feminine typing runs directly into the physical reality of how a manual typewriter actually works, and the two do not resemble each other at all. There is a smell that belongs specifically to a manual typewriter, machine oil and warm metal and the faint chemical tang of the ribbon ink, and Carol has stopped noticing it after 6 years, the same way she has stopped consciously hearing the room's constant clatter. That particular smell would arrive in her memory before almost anything else, more immediate even than the sight of the machine itself. Picture the standard manual typewriter of 1962, the kind sitting on Carol's desk right now, a Royal or an Underwood, heavy grey steel, easily 15 or 20 pounds of machine bolted to nothing, simply resting on the desk under its own considerable weight. There is no motor, there is no electricity involved, anywhere in its operation. Every single letter that appears on the page is the direct physical result of a finger striking a key with enough force to move a metal lever pulled a tight bar through an arc of several inches, fast enough and hard enough that the raised letter at the end of that tight bar strikes an inked ribbon, which in turn strikes the paper, which in turn tie. If there is enough force behind the whole chain of motion, leaves a legible impression on the page. I want you to sit with that mechanism for a moment, because it is not what most people imagine when they picture typing. This is not a light tap that a sensor detects. This is a mechanical strike closer in principle to the hammer inside a piano than to anything electronic. If Carol's finger does not deliver enough force, the type bar does not travel far enough or fast enough, and the letter comes out faint or partial or missing entirely. If the force is not consistent from one strike to the next, the pressure of the letters on the page varies visibly, and a trained eye, which every supervisor on that floor has, can spot uneven pressure from across the room. Now, remember that Carol is not typing onto a single sheet of paper. She is typing onto an original and 3 carbon copies, 4 layers of paper, separated by 3 layers of carbon, all rolled together around the platen. Every single keystroke has to generate enough force to punch cleanly through all 4 layers, transferring a legible mark not just onto the top sheet, but through it, through the first carbon, through the second sheet, through the second carbon, and finally onto the 4th and final copy at the very back of the stack. If the force is sufficient for the top copy, but insufficient for the bottom one, the bottom copy comes out faint or unreadable, and Carol will not know until she separates the pages at the end of the letter, at which point it is often too late to fix without starting over. This is why the keys did not click. They struck. A trained typist at speed is delivering, by conservative modern estimates, somewhere in the range of 1 to 2 pounds of force through her fingertip with every single key press, thousands and thousands of times across an 8-hour day. Multiply that across an average workday of roughly 10,000 keystrokes, which is a realistic figure for a typist handling correspondence at Carol's pace, and you begin to understand that what she is doing with her hands is not delicate at all. It is closer, in raw mechanical terms, to a form of light industrial labor performed with the fingers instead of the arms. The physical toll of this accumulates in specific, predictable ways. The pads of her fingers, particularly her index and middle fingers on both hands, have hardened over 6 years into something closer to a light callus than to soft skin, a direct physical adaptation to thousands of daily impacts. There is a specific permanent mark on the side of her right middle finger, a slight thickening of the skin, worn there by years of contact with the sharp edge of the shift key, which she presses to capitalize letters roughly as often as any other key on the machine. Her wrists ache by mid-afternoon in a way she has stopped mentioning to anyone because everyone around her has the exact same ache, and there is nothing to be done about it. The specific motion of striking a key, finger curling down and in with force, and then releasing quickly to strike the next key, repeated thousands of times an hour, places sustained, repetitive strain on the tendons running through the wrist, the same tendons that decades later occupational medicine would come to understand as vulnerable to a specific, debilitating condition, one that did not have a common name yet in 1962, though the women experiencing it certainly had their own private names for the ache in their forearms by 4 o'clock. Some of the older women on the floor, those who had spent 15 or 20 years at a manual typewriter rather than Carol's 6, carried a visible stiffness in their fingers that Carol has come to recognize as a kind of preview of her own future, a subtle curl to the knuckles that never fully released, even at rest, a slight difficulty. On the coldest mornings, straightening the fingers all the way before the day's typing, loosened them back into motion. Nobody called this an injury. It was simply understood the way a farmer understands a permanent stoop in his own back after decades in the field, as the ordinary and unremarkable cost of a long career spent doing this particular work. There is a woman near the front of row F, close to retirement age, whom the younger typists refer to among themselves, with a mixture of admiration and quiet dread, simply as the oldest hand on the floor, a woman who has spent nearly 30 years at a manual typewriter, and whose speed, remarkably, has never meaningfully declined, though the visible cost on her hands has become impossible to miss for anyone who looks closely. Carol watches her some mornings, the careful, deliberate way she flaxes her fingers before beginning the day's first letter, a small private ritual of warming joints that have given 3 decades of service to exactly the same repetitive motion Carol herself performs now, and she wonders without ever asking directly whether that same ritual awaits her own hands 24 years from now, assuming she is still at a desk like this one by then at all. Nobody on the floor has ever asked the woman in row F what 30 years of this work has actually cost her, and she has never once volunteered the answer, carrying it instead the same private, wordless way every other woman on that floor carries her own particular version. And then there is the lever. At the end of every single line of typing, Carol's right hand leaves the keys entirely and reaches for the carriage return lever, a metal arm extending from the left side of the machine, and throws it, a full, deliberate, physical sweep of the arm from right to left, hard enough to slide the entire carriage assembly, paper and all, back to the start of the next line, while simultaneously advancing the platen downward by exactly 1 line's height. This is not a button. This is a mechanical throw requiring real shoulder and arm engagement, performed at the end of every line, which means Carol performs it on an average letter, somewhere between 30 and 50 times, and across a full day of correspondence, several hundred times, a motion that engages the shoulder and the wrist in a single repeated sweep that by the end of the day has left a low, persistent ache across the top of her right shoulder blade that she has come to think of as simply part of what evening feels like. This is not a detail most people know, and it changes the picture entirely. The women of the 1962 typing pool were not performing delicate, decorative labor suited to their supposedly gentler constitution, which was, in fact, the exact language used in hiring manuals of the period to justify paying them a fraction of what men in the building earned. They were performing sustained, repetitive, physically demanding mechanical work, thousands of individual forceful strikes, an hour after hour, and their bodies absorbed the cost of it in calluses, in aching wrists, in shoulders that carried a permanent low-grade soreness that nobody in a position of authority ever thought to ask about. Because asking would have meant acknowledging that the work was physical in the first place, and acknowledging that would have complicated a great deal about how the era had decided to think about women and about work and about which kinds of labor counted as labor at all. Consider for a moment the actual daily total this represents. At a sustained pace of 70 words per minute, accounting for the average letter length in English of roughly 5 characters plus a space, Carol strikes something in the neighborhood of 420 keys every minute she is actively typing. Across a working day that includes roughly 6 hours of genuine hands-on keys typing time, once dictation, filing, and the walk to the supply cabinet are subtracted from the 8-hour shift, that works out to somewhere above 150,000 individual key strikes, each one requiring its own discrete application of force, each one a small, deliberate act of physical labor performed by a set of 10 fingers that receive no formal recognition anywhere in the building for the sheer physical volume of what they accomplish between 8 in the morning and 5 in the evening. There is a specific skill involved in managing all of this that took Carol years to develop, and that she has never once been asked to describe or explain to anyone, because no one in a position of authority over her has ever framed her work as a skill in the way a tradesman's work gets framed. She has learned, through pure repetition, exactly how much force each key on her particular machine requires. Because manual typewriters were not uniform, each one had its own personality, its own slightly worn springs, its own particular resistance that differed subtly from the machine at the next desk. When Carol's own typewriter went to the maintenance shop for its annual servicing, and she was issued a loaner for the 2 days it took to return, she spent that first loaner morning recalibrating her entire hand to a machine, a difference she registered within the first 3 letters and adjusted for without conscious thought by the second hour. This kind of calibration, repeated across thousands of individual keys and thousands of individual pounds of cumulative daily force, is the invisible expertise underneath what looked from across the room like simple, repetitive motion. It was not simple. It was a finely tuned physical relationship between one woman's hands and one particular machine, built up over months and years, and it disappeared completely from view the moment anyone tried to describe the job using the word just, as in, she is just a typist. Just typing letters. Just doing what any reasonably dexterous person could do with a bit of training. Close your eyes for a moment and consider what it would feel like to strike a hard surface with the pad of your finger with real, deliberate force, roughly 10,000 times before lunch. That is not a metaphor. That is Carol's Tuesday morning, and it is only the beginning of what today is going to ask of her. The smell alone would tell you something was different about this part of the job. Carbon paper has a distinct, faintly metallic, faintly waxy smell, and by mid-morning, Carol's fingertips carry a thin, grey residue from handling it. A residue that no amount of washing at the end of the day fully removes from the creases of her knuckles. Which brings us to the part of this job that produced more quiet anxiety than any other single element of it. More than the noise, more than the physical strain, more even than the supervisor's patrol down the aisle. The carbon copy. Here is how a letter actually gets typed at Continental Mutual in 1962. Carol does not simply roll one sheet of paper into her machine, she assembles a stack. The original letterhead goes on top. Behind it, a sheet of carbon paper, the coated side facing down toward the next sheet. Behind that, a plain copy sheet, usually a lighter, cheaper stock called onion skin. Behind that, another carbon sheet. A third carbon. A final copy sheet. 4 sheets of paper and 3 sheets of carbon, 7 layers in total, rolled together around the platen and fed through the machine as a single unit, so that one continuous act of typing produces the original letter and 3 legible copies simultaneously distributed to the underwriting file, the branch office, and the policyholder's permanent record. Assembling that 7-layer stack correctly every single time, before a single word can be typed, is its own small skill. One Carol performs so quickly now that she barely registers the individual motions, squaring the edges against the desk, because a carbon sheet inserted backward transfers nothing at all to the copy behind it, and the error is not discovered until the letter is finished and separated, at which point the entire stack has to be reassembled and retyped from the beginning, regardless of how flawlessly the actual words were struck. The carbon sheets themselves are unforgiving in a second way as well, staining anything they touch, a smudge of blue-black residue on a fingertip that transfers, if she is not careful, onto the cuff of her blouse or the pale fabric of her skirt. Stain that does not wash out easily, and that every typist on the floor has learned to guard against with the same instinctive care she applies to guarding her stockings against the sharp corners of the filing cabinets. Now consider what happens when Carol makes a mistake. Not a mistake in judgment, a mechanical mistake, a finger landing on the wrong key, a transposed letter in a policy number, an extra space where there should not be one. On a single sheet of paper, this is a minor inconvenience, fixed with a stroke of an eraser and a moment's pause. On a stack of 4 sheets separated by 3 layers of carbon, it is an entirely different problem. The error does not exist in one place. It exists in 4 places at once, on 4 separate sheets of paper, each one now sandwiched against a layer of carbon that will smear if handled carelessly, each one requiring its own individual correction, made separately, by hand, without disturbing the alignment of the stack, because if the stack shifts even slightly while Carol is correcting one layer, the correction on that layer will no longer line up with the uncorrected text on the layers above and below it when the sheets are eventually separated. And the entire letter will have to be retyped, regardless of how carefully she worked. I want you to think about the physical sequence this actually requires, because it is more delicate than it sounds. Carol has to roll the platen forward slightly to expose the error without ejecting the paper from the machine entirely, which would risk misalignment on reinsertion. She takes a small, hard rubber eraser kept in the top drawer specifically for this purpose, and works it against the original sheet with light, controlled pressure, removing the incorrect letter without tearing the paper or leaving a visible smudge on the letterhead. Then, and this is the part that most people, hearing about it for the first time, find genuinely difficult to believe, she has to separate the layers just enough to reach the carbon copies under the original without removing the whole stack from the machine, and erase the exact same character on each of the 3 copies individually, using a different, softer eraser designed not to tear the thinner onion skin paper, working blind in the narrow gap between sheets, feeling for the mistake by touch and memory rather than sight. Carol keeps a private, informal tally in her head of how many full pages she has had to discard and retype in any given month. Not written down anywhere, simply carried, the way a person carries an awareness of their own small failures. Some months, the number sits comfortably low, 3 or 4 pages across the entire month. The ordinary cost of doing demanding work at speed. Other months, when her concentration has been worn thin by a head cold or a poor night's sleep, or simply the accumulated fatigue of a long stretch without a full day off, the number climbs, and Carol feels each additional discarded page as a small, private failure, even though no one else on the floor would ever describe her work as anything other than excellent, because excellent, in this job, was measured against an error tolerance so close to 0 that even a highly skilled typist experienced her own ordinary human fallibility as something closer to a moral failing than a statistical certainty. Only after all 4 layers have been corrected, cleanly, invisibly, without smearing a single trace of loose carbon dust onto the surrounding text, Can Carol retype the correct letter, striking the key with exactly the same force and exactly the same touch as the surrounding text so that the correction is not visible as a correction at all, so that anyone reading the finished letter would never know that anything had gone wrong in the first place? This entire process, for a single mistaken letter, takes Carol somewhere between 45 seconds and a minute and a half, depending on how deep into the carbon stack the error needs correcting and how delicate the surrounding text is. It sounds small when described that way. It does not feel small at 11 in the morning on page 9 of a 12-page underwriting report, when Carol's finger lands a half-inch off target and she watches, in the fraction of a second before the type bar strikes, a mistake happen that she now has to spend the next 90 seconds silently, carefully undoing, while the clock behind the supervisor's desk keeps moving and the words per minute count for the morning keeps being calculated whether Carol is actively typing or not. And that is only the correctable mistake. There is a second category of error that cannot be corrected at all, no matter how careful the erasing. And every typist on the floor knows exactly where that line sits. If a mistake happens too close to the bottom of a page, where there is not enough room to erase and retype without the correction becoming visibly crowded or misaligned. If a mistake happens in a section of the document requiring a signature line or a policy number, where any visible alteration, however small, would be considered unacceptable on a legal or financial document. If Carol simply strikes the wrong key hard enough to tear through the thin onion skin copy paper while trying to correct an earlier error, which happens more often than anyone likes to admit, in any of these situations, there is no fix. The entire page, sometimes the entire multi-page letter, has to be pulled from the machine, discarded and retyped from the very beginning. All 7 layers reassembled from scratch, every previous line of accurate typing thrown away along with the one mistaken letter that ruined it. Carol has retyped entire 12-page reports because of a single transposed digit discovered on the final page. She has done it more times than she can count across 6 years, and she has never once complained about it out loud, because complaining about it would mean acknowledging how much of her day is spent not producing new work, but silently repairing and reproducing work she has already done once. Till one small, mechanical failure of a fingertip undid it. She remembers one particular afternoon the previous spring with unusual clarity. A 12-page underwriting summary due to leave the building on the 4:30 mail collection, the kind of document that had taken her nearly 2 hours to complete, and on the final page, checking her work before separating the carbon layers. She found a policy number transposed in the second paragraph, 2 digits swapped in a way that would have sent the letter to an entirely incorrect file if it had gone out uncorrected. It was 9 minutes past 4. She had 21 minutes to retype 12 full pages, 7 layers each, from scratch, and she did it. Hands moving faster than she had ever consciously asked them to move. No time for the careful, measured rhythm she normally kept. Simply speed and accuracy pushed to their absolute outer edge. And she delivered the corrected letter to the mailroom with 90 seconds to spare, her heart still racing, her blouse damp at the collar beneath her jacket, and no one on the floor ever knew how close that particular afternoon had come to a missed deadline, because by the time Miss Halloran's patrol reached row C again, Carol was already typing the next letter, composed, steady, as though nothing at all had happened. This is the mental vigilance the job actually demanded, and it is a category of labor that has almost no visible outward sign. From across the room, Carol simply looks like she is typing, steady and composed, the same posture, the same rhythm, hour after hour. What that posture is actually holding is a continuous, low-grade state of alert that never fully switches off for 8 hours, a part of her mind permanently monitoring every single keystroke for the small physical failures. And there is no way to wrest that vigilance without also risking the mistake it exists to prevent. A correction fluid product had been invented and patented a few years before this particular October. A white, paintable liquid a Texas typist and part-time inventor had developed in her own kitchen after growing tired of exactly this problem. It existed in 1962. It was not, however, in wide use at Continental Mutual and would not be for several more years, partly because company policy on correspondence appearance remained conservative about visibly painted over corrections, which showed as a faint raised patch under close light. Remained the standard every supervisor on the floor had been trained under, continued to enforce. Carol had heard of the product from a cousin who worked at a smaller firm across town, and she sometimes wondered, in the specific 90 seconds of a difficult 4-layer correction, what her afternoons might look like with a small bottle of it in her own desk drawer, an idle thought she never voiced to anyone. Because voicing it would have meant questioning a method Miss Halloran considered simply the correct way to do the job. The economics underneath all of this were as real as the mechanics. Paper cost money. Carbon paper cost money and wore out after a handful of uses, its coating thinning with each pass through the typewriter until the copies it produced grew faint regardless of how much force Carol applied. A ruined letter was not simply lost time. It was wasted stock, 7 sheets of paper and carbon that the department had already paid for, discarded and replaced by 7 more, a small but real cost that accumulated across 50 typists making their own small mistakes across an entire building, day after day, year after year, were hidden operating expense that never appeared on any balance sheet with Carol's name attached to it, but that her fingers were, in a very real sense, responsible for minimizing every single hour of the day. I want to pause here for a moment because it is easy to hear the word typist and picture something almost automatic, hands moving without much thought behind them. The opposite was true. Every single keystroke, thousands of times a day, carried a small, real consequence if it went wrong. And Carol's entire nervous system, whether she would have described it in those terms or not, was tuned to that consequence for every minute she sat at that desk. The composure on her face was not the absence of pressure. It was the visible result of managing that pressure so completely, so continuously, that it no longer showed. The layer of typing pool history discussed least often, and perhaps most surprising to hear laid out plainly, is what Carol is wearing underneath all of that composure, and what it cost her body simply to maintain the appearance of effortlessness. Start at the skin, the same way we did with Margaret Hollis in a cabin 100 years earlier, because the comparison is worth making. Carol wears a girdle. Not optional, not occasional, but a daily foundation garment made of heavy elasticized fabric, reinforced with rows of stitched boning designed to smooth and control the natural shape of her hips and waist under her skirt. It laces or hooks at the side, and it is tight enough that by early afternoon, Carol can feel the specific lines of pressure leaves across her lower ribs and hips, faint red marks that are still visible when she undresses that evening. She wears it every single day, every season, because a skirt that does not lie perfectly smooth against the body is considered, by the unwritten standards of the office, a sign of carelessness. Over the girdle, stockings, held up not by anything built into the girdle itself, but by a separate garter belt, 4 small clips gripping the top edge of each nylon stocking and holding it in place against the constant motion of a body that spends all day walking to the file room. The stockings themselves are sheer nylon, expensive relative to Carol's wages, and prone to running at the slightest snag, which means Carol checks the backs of her legs in the ladies' room mirror least twice a day and keeps a spare pair in her desk drawer for the inevitable morning when one tears on the edge of a filing cabinet before 9 o'clock. A single pair of good stockings costs Carol close to what she spends on lunch for an entire week, and a single snag against a splintered desk edge or a careless brush against a filing cabinet corner can end that pair's usable life in an instant. A small but real financial anxiety that runs underneath the more visible physical discomfort of wearing them. She has learned, the way every woman on the floor has learned to move through the narrow aisles between desks with a specific, careful awareness of her own legs, angling herself slightly away from sharp corners, an unconscious choreography that has become so automatic after 6 years that she no longer notices herself performing it. Though a person watching closely might notice the small, consistent way every woman on the floor seems to walk just slightly sideways past the metal filing cabinets lining the far wall. On her feet, heels, not flat, sensible shoes, but a low pump with at least 1.5 inches of heel, standard for office wear, regardless of the fact that Carol will be sitting at a desk for the overwhelming majority of the day, because the shoes are not really designed for the sitting. They are designed for the walk from the train, the walk through the lobby, the specific posture they force into her calves and lower back the moment she stands, a posture the office considers attractive and professional, and that any doctor examining her feet by the time she is 40 would likely describe using very different language. Carol keeps a private habit, one she suspects half the women on the floor share without ever discussing it openly, slipping her heels off beneath her desk during the quieter stretches of the afternoon, letting her stockinged feet rest flat against the cool tile for a few minutes at a time, always ready to slide back into the shoes at the first sound of Miss Halloran's approaching footsteps, because bare stockinged feet beneath a desk, however invisible to anyone actually looking, would not be considered appropriate if noticed. It is a small private rebellion, entirely silent, entirely deniable, and it provides just enough relief to the arches of her feet to make the second half of the day marginally more bearable than it would otherwise be. And then the dress or the skirt suit itself, tailored close enough to the body that it requires the girdle underneath to sit correctly, structured enough at the shoulder and waist that it holds its shape through 8 hours of movement without Carol having to think about it, provided every other layer underneath it is doing its job. Her hair takes nearly as much daily maintenance as her clothing. The 2 rolls she wears, set the night before with pin curls and a generous application of setting lotion, held through the day with a fine mist of hairspray applied before she leaves the apartment each morning, are meant to look effortless, meant to look as though her hair simply grows that way. And achieving that appearance of effortlessness requires close to 45 minutes of preparation the night before, and another 15. The morning of time that does not appear anywhere in the 8 hours she is paid for, because it happens entirely on her own clock before the workday has technically begun. Add together the girdle, the stockings and their garter belt, the heels, the set and sprayed hair, the lipstick reapplied at midday, and the total daily investment of unpaid preparation time Carol makes simply to arrive at her desk in a condition the office considers acceptable runs close to an hour every single working day. An hour that belongs entirely to the job in every practical sense, while counting on paper as nothing but her own personal grooming, entirely separate from and unrelated to her actual employment. Multiply that single hour across 5 days a week, across 6 years, and the number becomes difficult to hold in the mind all at once, an accumulated debt of unpaid time that never once appeared on a single paycheck because the office never had to acknowledge it existed in the first place. Reference back for a moment to what we have discussed on this channel before about the restrictive clothing of earlier eras. The corset gave way, generations before Carol's time, to looser, less structurally punishing garments, and popular history often tells that story as a story of liberation, women finally free of whalebone and lacing. What that story tends to leave out is that the girdle, the garment that replaced the corset in the mid-20th century wardrobe, was its own form of structural control, less rigid than whalebone, but no less mandatory, no less physically constant, no less capable of leaving marks on a body forced to sit inside it for 8 hours at a stretch. The logic of all of it was practical, in the sense that every individual piece served a purpose. The era considered important. A smooth silhouette, a polished, professional appearance, hair that looked deliberately, effortlessly done, rather than simply combed. And critically, every woman on that floor was wearing some version of the same architecture, which meant the physical cost of it was so evenly distributed across the entire room that almost no one thought to name it as a cost at all. It was simply what getting dressed for work looked like. Carol does not think of herself as uncomfortable most days, because discomfort at this consistent, familiar level stops registering as discomfort and starts registering simply as what a normal Tuesday feels like against the skin. It's only in the specific moments, unhooking the girdle at the end of the day, peeling the stockings down over legs that have carried faint red pressure lines since roughly 2 in the afternoon, that the accumulated cost of the day's uniform becomes visible again, if only to her in the privacy of her own bedroom, where no supervisor and no dictating executive will ever see it. There was a written dress code, printed on a single mimeographed sheet, handed to every new hire during her first week, and Carol still remembers most of it by heart. Skirts no shorter than the middle of the knee, no slacks under any circumstance, regardless of weather. Hosiery required at all times, without exception, even during the brief stretch of a particularly humid August when several typists arrived bare-legged and were sent home to change before the day officially began. Makeup was addressed only indirectly, through a single line requiring a neat and professional appearance, but every woman on the floor understood, without needing it spelled out further, that bare lips and an unpowdered face read, to Miss Halloran and to the department head above her, as somehow less finished, less put together, less ready for the responsibility of representing Continental Mutual on the page of a typed letter that no client would ever actually see her deliver. Carol remembers that particular August with unusual clarity, a stretch of nearly 2 weeks where the 4th floor's ceiling fans did almost nothing against the heat that pressed down on the entire room by mid-morning, sweat gathering at the small of every back under every mandatory layer of girdle and stocking and wool-blend skirt. 2 of the newer typists arrived one Wednesday without hosiery, a small, understandable rebellion against the heat that Miss Halloran addressed within the first 15 minutes of the shift, sending both women home to correct the oversight on their own time, an hour's round trip on the elevated train, before either of them was permitted to sit down at her desk. Carol remembers the quiet, simmering frustration that moved through the floor that particular week, never spoken aloud in Miss Halloran's hearing, but passed in glances and small, tight-lipped comments exchanged in the ladies' room. A shared understanding that the standard being enforced had very little to do with the actual quality of anyone's typing and everything, to do with an appearance that no client, no underwriting file, and no finished letter would ever once depend upon. Carol applied her lipstick each morning at the small mirror inside her apartment door, a deep coral shade she reapplies once, discreetly, in the ladies' room around midday, because a fully composed face at 9 in the morning that has visibly faded by 2 in the afternoon reads, again, as a small failure of the same unspoken standard. None of this took more than a few minutes at any single point in the day, but summed across the week, across the year, across 6 years, it represented a real and continuous investment of time and attention that existed for no purpose related to the actual typing itself. Time spent entirely in service of an appearance that the letters she produced never once required in order to be legible, accurate, or complete. The uniform of composure, in other words, was itself a form of labor, performed silently, underneath the visible labor of the typing itself, and it began before Carol ever sat down at her desk and did not fully end until she was home alone, finally able to take it off. For Carol, the supervisor's presence on the floor was its own particular pressure, one that operated less through anything spoken aloud and more through the simple, constant fact of being watched. Her name is Miss Halloran, and she has held the position of floor supervisor for row C through F for the past 3 years. She does not sit at a desk of her own for most of the day. She walks. A slow, deliberate patrol up and down the aisles between the rows, hands often clasped behind her back, pausing periodically behind a typist's chair to observe, without comment, the work in progress. The sound of her heels on the tile floor is to every typist on that section of the floor immediately identifiable and immediately significant. Carol can tell, without looking up, roughly where in the room Miss Halloran currently is, simply by the direction and proximity of that particular, unhurried footstep. And every typist on the floor adjusts, if only slightly, whatever she is doing the moment she registers that sound approaching her own row. Posture straightens. Conversation, already rare during working hours, stops entirely. Eyes that may have drifted toward a clock or a window return to the page in the machine. This was not paranoia. It was an accurate read of the actual system Carol was working inside. Part of Miss Halloran's job, formally assigned to her by the office manager above her, was to track the output of every typist on her section, measured in words per minute, calculated from the volume of correspondence each woman completed against the time she spent completing it. This figure was recorded weekly. It was visible, in aggregate, to the department head. It factored directly into who received the more demanding, higher status correspondence work, who was considered for the rare promotion to executive secretary, and who was quietly moved to less desirable, lower-paying sections of the pool. Her numbers consistently lagged behind the room's average. Carol has been called to Miss Halloran's small station only twice in 6 years, both times for genuine lapses, a run of careless errors during a week she was fighting off a bad cold the first time, a missed deadline on an urgent policy letter the second. Both conversations were quiet, brief, and delivered without raised voices, which somehow made them worse than shouting would have. A controlled, disappointed correction that left Carol replaying the exchange in her head for days afterward, far longer than the actual infraction seemed to warrant. She has watched the same brief, quiet conversation happen to other women on the floor more times than she can count, and she has noticed, without ever discussing it with anyone, that the women called to that station tend to leave it walking a little faster than usual. Back to their desks, heads down, eyes fixed straight ahead. Absorbing the correction in the most private way available to them in a room with no walls and no doors. Which brings us to the question that nobody asked out loud, but every single woman on that floor was quietly managing every single hour of every single day. How do you sustain your fastest possible typing speed for 8 consecutive hours while also maintaining zero tolerance for the kind of error that costs a full-page retype, while also sitting in a girdle and heels, while also absorbing a wall of noise loud enough to leave your ears ringing, while also being visibly, continuously observed by a woman whose own performance review depended in part on how well she kept your row's numbers moving? The answer, for Carol and for most of the women around her, was a kind of practiced, invisible endurance, a posture of calm competence, held in place through sheer discipline, regardless of what was actually happening underneath it. She learned, in her first year on the floor, exactly how Miss Halloran's patrol pattern worked, roughly every 20 minutes down each row, and she learned the way every experienced typist on the floor eventually learns to pace her own small human needs around that pattern. A stretch of the fingers, a brief roll of the shoulders, a glance at the clock, all of it timed, without ever discussing it with anyone, to the small windows when Miss Halloran's attention was elsewhere. Miss Halloran herself is not, in Carol's private assessment, an unkind woman. She has worked in this building for over 20 years, starting in the same pool Carol sits in now, and she understands the work from the inside, in a way the department heads above her never will. But she has also internalized, completely and without apparent conflict, the idea that her value to the company depends on how tightly she can manage the output of the women beneath her, and that internalized pressure moves directly through her, and onto the floor, onto Carol, onto every typist within the sound of her footsteps. There are moments, rare but real, when the woman Miss Halloran was before 20 years of this particular role shows through the surface of the supervisor she has become. Carol remembers a bitterly cold morning the previous winter when a young typist in row D arrived, visibly shaken after a difficult commute, and Miss Halloran, instead of the brisk correction Carol half expected, quietly walked the woman to the small break room, brought her a cup of coffee from her own private pot, and gave her 10 unscheduled minutes to compose herself before returning to the floor, an act of genuine kindness that Miss Halloran performed without comment and never referenced again. Carol has held onto that memory as a kind of counterweight to the more frequent, more clipped version of Miss Halloran that patrols the aisles, a reminder that the woman enforcing this system is also her own way, a product of it, shaped by the same building, the same 20 years of learning exactly how much of herself the job would allow her to show. The emotional labor this created was constant and almost entirely invisible from outside the room. She was simultaneously typing, monitoring the sound of approaching footsteps, calculating whether her pace for the morning would meet the unspoken benchmark, and managing her own visible expression so that none of that internal calculation ever showed on her face. A supervisor patrolling the aisle wanted to see calm, capable, uncomplaining competence. Anything else, a furrowed brow, visible sigh, a moment of frustration at a mistake, risked being read not as the ordinary human response to an honestly demanding task, but as a sign that a particular typist could not handle the pace information that would find its way eventually into the kind of quiet conversation. This is the broader context worth sitting with for a moment. The management practices governing the typing pool in 1962 did not emerge from nowhere. They were a direct descendant of scientific management principles developed decades earlier. Time motion studies originally designed to optimize factory assembly lines, applied with almost no modification to the labor of women producing paperwork instead of parts. The typing pool was managed like a production line because, in the most literal structural sense, it was designed to be one, laid out on the same efficiency principles, measured against the same output metrics, supervised with the same close continuous surveillance that a factory floor manager would apply to workers on an assembly belt. There was a sheet, kept in a folder on Miss Halloran's small station near the front of the floor, that ranked every typist in rows C through F by weekly average words per minute and weekly error rate. And while it was not posted publicly, everyone on the floor knew it existed. Gathered from small comments and the occasional overheard conversation between supervisors of roughly where they sat on it. Carol has ranked in the top handful of that sheet for most of the past 3 years, a fact that brings her a specific, complicated satisfaction, pride in her own skill mixed with a quieter awareness that the entire system measuring that skill was designed by people who would never have to sit inside it themselves, and had built it to reward exactly the qualities, speed, accuracy, uncomplaining consistency, that kept the floor's output high, without ever once asking whether the pace being measured was one a human body could sustain indefinitely without cost. The difference was only that the product coming off this particular line was a letter instead of a machine part, and the workers producing it wore lipstick and skirts instead of coveralls. A difference in appearance so complete that almost no one at the time, and remarkably few people since, thought to describe the two systems using the same language. Even though the underlying architecture of observation, measurement, and quiet pressure was functionally identical. If the fire and water of the frontier morning was invisible physical labor a century earlier, the typing pool's version of that same invisible cost was stillness combined with force, a combination the body was never designed to absorb for 8 straight hours. By early afternoon, Carol's body has developed a specific catalogue of aches that she has stopped mentioning to anyone because everyone around her carries some version of the same list. Her eyes are tired in a way that has nothing to do with sleepiness, a dry, gritty strain from hours spent focused at a fixed close distance, shifting constantly between the page in the machine and the transcript propped beside it. Under fluorescent lighting that flickers at a frequency too fast to consciously notice, but not too fast for the eye to feel the cumulative effect of by 3 in the afternoon. Her head aches, a low pressure behind her eyes, that she has come to think of simply as the Tuesday feeling, though it visits her nearly every day of the week, regardless of what the calendar says. There is a particular moment most afternoons when Carol notices all of these small aches at once, a brief, involuntary inventory that surfaces during the seconds it takes to roll a finished letter free of the platen and reach for the next blank stack. Before her attention returns fully to the page in front of her, and the individual complaints fade back into the general background hum of the day. It never lasts longer than a breath or two. There is never time for it to last any longer than that. Her lower back holds a specific, familiar tightness from 8 hours in a wooden chair with no cushioning to speak of, a chair designed for cost efficiency rather than posture, forcing Carol to hold her own spine upright through muscular effort alone rather than any support built into the furniture. And her wrists, the same wrists absorbing thousands of forceful keystrokes in 7:52 that morning, carry an ache that by 4 o'clock has become difficult to fully separate from the ache in her fingers, a diffuse soreness running from fingertip to forearm that she flexes and shakes out during the rare pauses in her workload. A habit so automatic she no longer notices herself doing it. This is where the peppermint candy in the bottom drawer earns its place in Carol's day. At 3 o'clock, when the accumulated fatigue of the day reaches the point where her concentration truly begins to slip, when she has caught herself twice in the last 10 minutes reaching for the wrong key entirely rather than simply striking the right one imprecisely, she opens the drawer, unwraps a single candy, and lets the sharp, clean taste of peppermint cut through the fog for just long enough to carry her into the final 2 hours of the shift. It is a small ritual, entirely private, and it works most days well enough to get her through. Carol saw a doctor about her wrist once, during her 3rd year, when the ache had grown sharp enough one week that she genuinely worried something was wrong beyond ordinary tiredness. The doctor, a general practitioner near her old neighborhood, examined her hand for perhaps 90 seconds, asked what kind of work she did, told her, not unkindly, that a bit of soreness was to be expected in her line of work, and suggested a warm soak in the evenings, and perhaps a looser grip on the pencil when she was taking dictation. There was no diagnosis offered, because there was at the time no widely recognized diagnosis to offer. There was no referral to a specialist, because the kind of specialist who might have taken her wrists seriously as an occupational injury rather than an ordinary complaint did not yet meaningfully exist in the medical practice available to a woman of Carol's income. She left the appointment mildly reassured and mildly embarrassed for having gone at all, and she has not been back since, managing the ache instead with the warm soaks the doctor suggested, taken most evenings in a shallow basin she keeps under the bathroom sink, a home remedy for what a later era would recognize, examine, name, and eventually attempt to prevent through entirely different means. Chairs, redesigned around the spine, keyboards angled to reduce strain on the wrist, mandated breaks built directly into a workday's structure. None of those changes would arrive in time to spare Carol's own hands, which would simply go on doing exactly what they had always done for as many years as the job required of them. What Carol is experiencing, though neither she nor anyone else on that floor has language for it yet, is the accumulated physical cost of what a later generation of occupational medicine would eventually classify and name a category of repetitive strain injury caused by sustained, forceful, repetitive motion of the hands and wrist, made worse by poor posture, made worse by furniture designed without any consideration for the body using it, made worse by an environment offering no built-in rest, no rotation of tasks, no acknowledgement that the human body performing this labor might have physical limits worth designing around. The broader context here is worth naming plainly. Occupational health, as a field of serious medical and legal concern, was still decades away from taking clerical work seriously as a category of physical labor. The research that would eventually document the connection between repetitive keystroke work and long-term wrist and hand damage would not meaningfully begin until the following decade, and the resulting protections, better chairs, adjustable desks, would take decades longer still to reach anything resembling the fourth floor of the Continental Mutual building. Carol's body was absorbing, in real time, the cost of a system that would not be formally recognized as harmful until long after her own working years were finished. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that none of this registered, at the time, as an injury in any formal sense. Carol did not think of her aching wrists as a workplace hazard. She thought of them simply what her hands felt like by 4 o'clock, the same way Miss Halloran likely thought of her own tired feet, the same way every woman on that floor had quietly absorbed some version of the same lesson, that the body's cost of doing this work was not a problem to be solved, but a fact to be endured privately without complaint. Because complaint changed nothing, and the letters still needed typing, regardless of how her wrists felt about it. The headaches deserve their own mention because they arrive with a regularity that Carol has come to treat almost as a fixed feature of the calendar rather than a symptom worth investigating. 3, sometimes 4 afternoons a week, a tightness gathers behind her eyes, sometime around 2 o'clock, and settles into a dull, persistent pressure that lasts through the remainder of the shift, and often into the evening, fading only after a full night's sleep. She has attributed it, when she thinks about it at all, to the fluorescent lighting or to the strain of focusing at close range on small print for hours at a stretch, or simply to the cumulative tension she carries in her jaw and shoulders without meaning to. Whatever the precise cause, the aspirin that circulates informally through the pool exists largely because of headaches exactly like Carol's. A quiet, shared acknowledgement among the women of the floor that this particular ailment is common enough to require no explanation whenever someone reaches across the aisle asking whether anyone has a spare tablet. The one true break in Carol's day is lunch, 30 minutes, taken in a small room on the same floor, furnished with a handful of tables and a bank of vending machines. And even this half hour carries its own quiet arithmetic. 30 minutes is barely enough time to eat, use the ladies' room, and be back at her desk with margin to spare before the whistle. And Carol has learned to move through all 3 with the same practiced efficiency she applies to her typing, because arriving back at her desk even a minute late registers on some invisible ledger Miss Halloran keeps in her head, if nowhere else, as a small mark against her. There is no other formally scheduled rest in the day. No coffee break in the modern sense, No built-in moment where a typist is expected, or even permitted, to simply stop and let her hands recover. What recovery exists happens in the small gaps between tasks, the few seconds while a finished letter is being pulled from the machine and a new stack of carbon assembled for the next one. Seconds that Carol and every woman around her have learned to use for exactly this purpose. A quick shake of the wrist, a roll of the shoulders. A blink held a beat longer than necessary to rest eyes that have been fixed at close range since morning. Her body absorbed the cost of a system built entirely around output, and the system, by its own design, was never asked to account for what that output actually required of the person producing it. For Carol, the hierarchy of the building presented a particular challenge that had nothing to do with her competence and everything to do with how that competence was allowed to be seen. She has, by this point in her 6 years at Continental Mutual, developed a working knowledge of underwriting terminology that rivals some of the junior men in the department upstairs. She catches errors in the dictated letters she types, an incorrect policy figure, a misapplied clause, a sentence that would read as ambiguous to a policyholder reading it at home. She corrects these errors silently in her own head, typing the version that makes sense rather than the version that was technically dictated, and the executives who sign these letters almost never notice the substitution because the corrected version simply reads as competent, ordinary business correspondence. There was a particular letter drafted the previous winter by a junior underwriting manager named Mr. Prede Coughlin, in which he had dictated a coverage exclusion clause with a critical word omitted, a mistake that would have meaningfully altered the legal meaning of the paragraph had it gone out exactly as spoken. Carol caught it the moment she typed it, paused for perhaps 2 seconds, and simply typed the version that made the clause coherent and legally sound, rather than the version Mr. Coughlin had actually dictated. He signed the letter without noticing the substitution, thanked her in passing for her usual excellent work, as he did most weeks, and never once considered that the coherent, legally sound version he had just put his name to existed because a 24-year-old typist in row C had quietly repaired his sentence before it ever reached a client. Carol did not mention it. There was no version of that conversation available to her that would not have required either correcting a superior in a way the office culture did not permit, or staying silent, and she had learned, long before that particular Tuesday, which of those 2 options the job actually allowed. She has never once been asked her opinion on an underwriting decision. She has never been invited to sit in on the meetings where those decisions get made, meetings that happen 2 floors above her, in rooms with carpet and windows and a level of quiet she experiences for exactly 1 hour a day, at lunch, in the small break room shared by the entire 4th floor. The hiring manuals used to bring women like Carol into this building, specify, in language that was entirely ordinary for the period, that the ideal typist possesses a pleasant disposition, a neat appearance. Intelligence appears nowhere on that list, not because the women hired lacked it, but because the job, as designed, had no mechanism for rewarding it, even when it was plainly present. Carol understood this arrangement without ever having it explained to her directly, the way most workplace realities of this kind get absorbed rather than announced. Her value to the company was measured entirely in speed and accuracy, in words per minute and error rates, and any capability beyond that, judgment, initiative, the quiet correction of a superior's mistake, existed for her own private satisfaction and nowhere else. It appeared on no evaluation. It earned no raise. It simply happened, quietly, inside her own head, dozens of times a week. And then it disappeared into a finished letter that someone else signed his name to. There were exceptions to this system, rare enough that every woman on the floor, knew exactly who they were. A handful of women each year moved from the general pool into a position as an executive secretary, a personal assistant to a single manager, rather than a shared resource, typing whatever letters the pool assigned her. This was considered, correctly, a genuine promotion, better pay, more autonomy, occasionally even a desk with a small measure of privacy. But the criteria for that promotion, as understood by every woman watching it happen, rewarded speed, reliability, and a particular kind of unthreatening, agreeable presence at least as much as it rewarded raw skill, and sometimes considerably more. Carol watched a woman named Ruth Fairbanks receive exactly this promotion the previous spring, moving from a desk 2 rows over into a private office on the 6th floor. And she remembers the conversation among the women in row C afterward, with a clarity that has not faded. Ruth was well-liked, competent, certainly deserving, in the ordinary sense of the word. She was also, several of the women noted quietly among themselves, considerably less likely than some others on the floor to ever point out an error in an executive's dictation, however small, preferring simply to type what was said and let the mistake stand rather than risk the discomfort of a correction. Carol has never resented Ruth for the promotion and has never fully decided, in the months since, whether she herself would want that same private office if it were offered to her, given what she has observed at close range about which particular qualities tend to earn it. There is a woman 2 desks down from Carol, a typist named Dorothy, who joined the pool the same year Carol did, who holds a degree from a 2-year college, a genuine rarity among the women on that floor in 1962. Earned in accounting before family circumstances brought her back to her hometown and into a job that used perhaps 1/10 of what she had actually studied. Dorothy never mentions the degree at work. Carol only learned about it in her 2nd year, during a lunch conversation, and the 2 of them have never discussed it again because there is nowhere for that information to go inside a system that hired Dorothy for her typing speed and has never once in 6 years asked her a single question about anything else she might know. Carol still remembers the particular quiet in Dorothy's voice, the day she mentioned it, almost apologetic, as though the degree itself were a slightly embarrassing detail rather than a genuine accomplishment. The kind of thing you might confess about a hobby nobody else finds especially interesting. Dorothy had wanted, briefly, to apply for an opening in the actuarial department 2 floors up, a position that would have used her actual training, and she had mentioned the idea once, carefully, to her own row supervisor, who had suggested, not unkindly but with a finality that closed the conversation entirely, that the position would likely go to one of the young men currently training in the department, and that Dorothy's talents were better suited to the pool in any case. Dorothy did not apply. She has not mentioned the actuarial department again in the 4 years since, and Carol has never once heard her raise the subject, though she has noticed, without ever saying so, the particular speed and precision with which Dorothy handles any letter involving a complicated calculation. For work that asks more of her than the job technically requires and receives in return exactly nothing beyond her ordinary wage. The wage disparity underneath all of this was not hidden, exactly, simply unremarked upon, the way a fact everyone already knows rarely gets said aloud. A junior male clerk hired the same year as Carol, performing work that required considerably less measurable skill than her own typing and shorthand, started at a salary meaningfully higher than Carol's after 6 years of raises, a gap every woman on the floor understood, and none of them had any real avenue to challenge, because the entire wage structure of the building had been built on the assumption that a man's income was meant to support a family, and a woman's was meant to supplement one, an assumption that said nothing true about Carol's own household budget, her own rent, her own wedding fund, but shaped her paycheck regardless. The system did not lack for capable women. It simply had no structural mechanism for recognizing capability as something separate from docility and output, and it had been built deliberately by people who benefited from that particular blind spot because a workforce paid a fraction of what men earned for equivalent skill was, from the perspective of the company's balance sheet, quote, an extremely efficient arrangement, one worth preserving exactly as it was. What made this arrangement survivable day after day was something the company never designed and never particularly wanted: a quiet, informal network of mutual support that ran underneath the entire structure of the pool. If you walked the aisles of row C through F on any ordinary afternoon, you would see, on the surface, exactly what the company intended you to see. 50 women working independently, each one focused entirely on her own stack of correspondence. No visible connection between one desk and the next, beyond the shared architecture of the room itself. What you would not see, because it was never designed to be seen, was the constant low-level current of mutual attention running beneath that surface. 50 women each keeping a quiet, peripheral awareness of the others around her, ready to notice a stumble, a slowed pace, a hand pressed briefly against a temple, and to respond to it in whatever small way the moment allowed, without ever breaking the appearance of independent, uninterrupted work. Carol and Peggy are the most visible example of it to each other, but the pattern repeats itself in dozens of small variations across the floor. A woman 2 rows over keeps a tin of aspirin in her desk and passes tablets without comment to anyone who mentions a headache within earshot. Another keeps a spare pair of stockings for exactly the kind of emergency run Carol occasionally needs herself. When someone falls behind on a difficult letter, close to the lunch bell, with Miss Halloran's patrol approaching, it is not unusual for the woman at the next desk to quietly finish typing the final 2 lines from memory of the dictation, passed along in a whisper during the brief overlap when both of them happened to be reaching for the same shared stapler. The lunchroom carried its own quiet version of this same network. Women from every row gathering in loose, shifting clusters around the same handful of tables, trading small pieces of useful intelligence, the way any group of people managing the same difficult conditions eventually learns to. Which vending machine sandwich to avoid on a Monday, when the bread tended to be a day past its best? Which of the executives upstairs dictated at a pace that was nearly impossible to keep up with? And which of them mercifully spoke slowly and repeated himself without being asked? Which afternoon, based on nothing more concrete than instinct built from years of watching her patterns, Miss Halloran tended to leave the floor early for a meeting upstairs, opening a rare, brief window when the pace of the room eased by some small, unspoken degree. None of this was organized. None of it was named, discussed, or acknowledged by management in any way. It existed entirely in the margins of a system that offered the women inside it no formal protection, and it grew there anyway, the way certain plants find a way to grow in the cracks of a sidewalk, regardless of how carefully that sidewalk was poured. The network extended beyond physical favors into something closer to shared intelligence. A quiet system of warnings passed row to row whenever conditions on the floor shifted in a way worth knowing about. If the department head upstairs had been in a foul mood during a morning meeting, word of it traveled through the pool within the hour, carried by whichever secretary happened to overhear it, and every typist adjusted her own vigilance accordingly for the rest of the day, expecting shorter tempers and less patience for the ordinary small errors that any office absorbs on an easier day. If a particularly difficult executive was dictating that afternoon, a man known throughout the floor for a rapid mumbling delivery that even experienced shorthand writers struggled to keep pace with, the woman assigned to take his dictation could usually count on a sympathetic look or a quietly offered cup of water from whoever sat nearest her once the ordeal was finished. Carol relies on this network more than she would ever say out loud. When her monthly cycle brings the kind of cramping that makes an 8-hour day at a hard wooden chair genuinely difficult, it is Peggy who notices first, without Carol having to explain anything, and quietly takes on an extra letter or two from Carol's stack during the slowest part of the afternoon. When Peggy's mother was briefly hospitalized the previous winter, it was Carol who covered for her twice during unscheduled trips to the pay telephone in the lobby, without either of them ever discussing it as a favor that needed repaying, because it was simply understood that this was what the two of them did for each other, and what most of the women on the floor did for each other in smaller, quieter ways, all day, every day. The small joys of the floor traveled through this same quiet network. A birthday meant a card passed desk to desk during the morning's first lull, signed in a dozen different hands, and occasionally, if someone's household budget allowed it that particular month, a small cake shared during the lunch break, cut into pieces small enough that everyone in the immediate rows got a taste. An engagement, like Carol's own the previous year, was met with a genuine warmth that crossed the entire section. Women she barely spoke to, beyond a nod in the hallway, stopping by her desk over the following days. A small ritual of shared happiness that cost the company nothing and belonged entirely to the women who created it for each other. There is a particular kind of solidarity that forms specifically inside conditions like these. Not the loud, organized solidarity of a movement, but the small, practical, moment-to-moment solidarity of women who share the exact same physical experience of a demanding day, have learned, without ever holding a meeting about it, that helping each other through it costs almost nothing and returns a great deal. A glance exchanged across the aisle after a particularly difficult stretch of dictation. A shared look when Miss Halloran's footsteps pass a little too slowly behind someone's chair. None of it changed the wages, the hours, or the underlying structure of the job. But it changed, in small and real ways, what it felt like to survive inside that structure. And Carol has never once taken it for granted. The clock behind Miss Halloran's station finally reaches 5, and the sound that has filled Carol's ears since 7:52 that morning stops. Not gradually, but almost all at once, dozens of typewriters falling silent within the same 30 seconds as the whole floor reaches the end of its shift together. What replaces it is not true silence. Chairs scraping back, voices finally rising above a whisper, the shuffle of coats being pulled from the backs of chairs. But after 8 hours of continuous mechanical noise, even this ordinary human commotion sounds. She finishes her last letter with 2 minutes to spare, squares the finished stack of correspondence into a neat pile at the corner of her desk, and pulls a heavy vinyl cover down over her typewriter, snapping it into place along the edges. It is a small, unremarkable motion she has performed thousands of times, and it carries every single day a specific small relief that she has never articulated to anyone, the physical signal that the machine and everything it demanded of her hands for the past 8 hours is finally done, asking. 50 women leave the 4th floor within roughly the same 15-minute window most evenings. A loose, informal exodus down the same elevators and through the same lobby, and there is a specific wordless camaraderie in that shared departure that Carol has come to value more than she might have expected when she first started the job. A nod exchanged with a woman from row F, whose name she has never quite learned. A brief, tired smile from Dorothy, walking a few steps ahead toward her own train line. None of it requires conversation. It is simply the recognition, passed silently between women who spent the same 8 hours inside the same wall of noise, that the day is now, finally, behind all of them at once. The walk from her desk to the elevator, down through the lobby, out onto the street, is its own kind of transition. The October air outside the building is cool enough to feel actually good against her face after a day spent under fluorescent lighting. And Carol notices, the way she notices most evenings, that her shoulders have started to drop from the height they held all day the moment she steps outside and no longer has to hold them for anyone's observation. The train ride home is standing room only, again the same as the morning, but there is a different quality to the exhaustion Carol carries onto it now, a full-body tiredness that has nothing left to prove to anyone. Her hands, resting on the pole she is holding to steady herself against the train's motion, have finally stopped moving in the small, automatic way they sometimes do, even after the shift ends, fingers twitching faintly through the motions of words she has spent all day typing. By the third stop, even that has settled, and her mind, which has spent 8 hours holding a continuous low-grade vigilance against every possible keystroke error, is finally, blessedly, allowed to go quiet. The apartment, when she reaches it, is small and a little cold because neither she nor Peggy can justify running the radiator before 6 most evenings. But it is quiet in a way. The 4th floor of Continental Mutual never once is, and that quiet, more than anything else, is what Carol has been walking toward since 5 o'clock. Peggy is usually home first, already out of her heels, already in the worn cardigan she keeps for evenings, and there is a particular, wordless understanding between them. On nights like this one, neither of them needing to narrate the specific shape of the day's exhaustion. Carol kicks off her own shoes just inside the door, the relief of that single motion nearly as significant as anything else in her evening, and unhooks the girdle beneath her dress the moment she reaches the privacy of the bedroom, breathing out fully for what feels like the first time since 7 that morning. She counts the envelope in her dresser drawer out of habit rather than necessity, because she already knows the number, and adds tonight's math in her head, the wedding still 5 months away, the total still slightly short of where she wants it to be by spring, a small, quiet pressure she carries alongside everything else without ever mentioning it to Walter, who has his own version of the same math running in a ledger at his own apartment across town. There is a particular loneliness folded into this kind of independence, one the era like to describe using words like freedom and opportunity, the modern working girl making her own way in the city. Some of that was true. Carol earns her own wage, keeps her own apartment, makes her own decisions about her own evenings in a way her mother's generation, for the most part, did not. But the freedom came bundled with a specific, private exhaustion that nobody in the recruitment posters ever pictured, the particular fatigue of a body that has spent all day functioning as a component in someone else's production line, followed by an evening with barely enough energy left to eat a simple supper. Carol eats supper, standing at the small kitchen counter most nights. Something quick, toast or a can of soup warmed on the single working burner, because sitting down to a full meal after a day like today feels like more effort than her body currently has available. She and Peggy talk for a while briefly, about nothing important, the day's smaller frustrations. A funny thing one of the executives said during dictation, the ordinary debris of 2 young women processing an ordinary hard day together before either of them has the energy for anything more demanding than sleep. Peggy has no wedding on her own horizon, no particular plan yet for what comes after Carol moves out to start her life with Walter in the spring. And though neither of them has said much about it directly, Carol knows the coming change weighs on Peggy in its own quiet way. The practical question of a new roommate to help cover the rent tangled together with the simple loss of a friendship that has anchored both their days for 6 years running. They have talked, in the loose, half-serious way 2 tired women talk about a future. Neither of them has fully mapped about Peggy taking over the apartment alone if she can manage the rent, or finding someone new through the pool. A comparison that always makes them both laugh despite, or perhaps because of, how much genuine truth sits underneath the joke. Carol has thought more than once about what happens to her position. Company policy does not require her to resign upon marriage, a rule that had only shifted in recent years and that still varied considerably from one employer to the next across the city. But the informal expectation among many of the women on the floor and among a fair number of the executives upstairs leaned toward the assumption that a married woman's income was supplemental, temporary, a bridge rather than a career. Carol has not decided on this particular Tuesday night whether she intends to keep typing at Continental Mutual after the spring or whether Walter's steadier, better paid position will eventually make that decision for her in the quiet, unspoken way these decisions tended to get made in households like the one she is about to help build. It is not a question she has to answer tonight, and she lets it drift, unresolved, somewhere at the edge of sleep. What she does know, with the specific clarity of 6 years of practiced routine, is that Wednesday will look almost exactly like today looked, and Thursday after that, and Friday after that, an entire working life, measured out, not in dramatic events, but in an accumulation of nearly identical days, each one demanding the same precision, the same quiet management of noise and force and fear of a single ruined page from a body that receives no formal acknowledgement anywhere in the building, that any of it cost her anything at all. By 9 o'clock, Carol is in bed. Tomorrow is Wednesday, and Wednesday will ask exactly the same thing of her hands, her wrists, her eyes, and her patience that today did, and the day after that will ask it again, and the specific weight of that repetition, the knowledge that this exact demanding rhythm will simply continue. Until the wedding in the spring changes some of the details of her life, without necessarily changing the fundamental shape of her working days at all, is not something Carol dwells on for long before sleep takes her. It is simply Tuesday, turning into Wednesday, the way it always does. Step back for a moment from the details, from the noise and the girdles and the carbon paper and the sound of Miss Halloran's heels on the tile, and look at the whole of it. Look at what a single, ordinary Tuesday in October 1962 actually required of the woman who lived it. There is a pattern here, and once you see it, you will see it in every glossy magazine illustration and every glamorized television version of this era that you encounter for the rest of your life. The first pattern is this. The appearance of effortless polish required a body operating under constant, sustained physical strain. Every element of the mid-century office image that still circulates today, the composed posture, the flawless correspondence, the calm and capable expression, was the visible surface of a system of physical labor, demanding enough to leave calluses on the fingers, aches in the wrists, and a permanent low ringing in the ears by the end of most days. There was nothing effortless about it. The effortlessness was the performance. The strain was the reality underneath it, and the woman producing that performance was absorbing a physical cost that the era had no name for and no framework to take seriously, because the job had been categorized from its very design as light, clerical, and suited to what the hiring manuals of the period liked to call the gentler sex. Think about how thoroughly that categorization shaped everything that followed from it. Because the work was labeled light, the furniture was never redesigned around the body performing it. Because the work was labeled clerical rather than industrial, no safety regulation ever considered the noise levels these women absorbed for 8 hours a day. Because the work was labeled naturally suited to women, no one thought to ask whether the specific physical demands of a manual typewriter, the force, the repetition, the sustained precision, might actually be a demanding athletic performance dressed in a skirt and heels rather than an easy, gentle occupation requiring no particular strength or stamina at all. The label came first, and every subsequent decision about the room, the furniture, the hours, and the pace flowed downstream from that label, regardless of what the actual physical evidence, written in Carol's own calloused hands, might have suggested to anyone willing to look closely enough to see it. The second pattern is this. Precision was demanded without protection, and competence was assumed without ever being formally recognized. Carol's accuracy, her speed, her ability to catch and silently correct another person's mistakes before they ever reached a client's desk, was the actual engine producing Continental Mutual's daily output, and none of it appeared anywhere on a review, a raise, or a promotion that reflected its true value. The system extracted her full capability and returned to her only a fraction of its worth, measured out in a paycheck built on the assumption that her income was supplemental rather than essential, regardless of how essential her labor actually was to the machinery of the building she worked inside. The third pattern is this, and it may be the one that matters most. The modern corporate economy, the entire vast apparatus of paperwork and policy and correspondence that built the mid-century American company into the institution it became, was constructed, quite literally, on the physical force of women's fingers striking metal keys thousands of times a day. Not metaphorically. Mechanically. Every letter, every underwriting decision, every shareholder report that left a building like Continental Mutual passed through a typing pool exactly like this one, through a woman exactly like Carol, and the entire structure depended, at its most basic physical level, on her hands doing precisely what they were asked to do, at precisely the speed required, with an error rate close enough to zero that the machinery of the company never once had to slow down to accommodate the human being operating it. And the fourth pattern, the one that connects most directly to the woman sitting in the corner office in the opening image of this video. The typing pool was never separate from that glamorous world. It was the foundation underneath it. Every dictated letter that made an executive look decisive and articulate passed through a typist's hands before it left the building, corrected, formatted, made presentable, often silently improved from what was actually dictated. The polish of the entire operation, the polish the magazines loved to photograph, rested on labor that those same magazines never once thought to point a camera toward. There is a fifth pattern worth naming before we return to Carol herself, one that connects this room directly to every other room this channel has spent time inside. Modern attempts to physically replicate this kind of labor, museum demonstrations where visitors are invited to sit at a genuine manual typewriter for even 20 or 30 minutes and attempt sustained, accurate typing at speed, consistently produce the same reaction. Fingers tire faster than expected. Accuracy drops sharply after the first 10 minutes. The specific, sustained force required to strike each key cleanly proves far more demanding in practice than it ever looks from a distance. And these are modern volunteers attempting the task for half an hour, with the full knowledge that they can simply stop the moment their hands grow tired. Carol did not have that option. She did not have a half hour. She had 8 every single day, and stopping was never a choice available to her at all. Carol Whitfield is not the woman in the opening image, and she is also, in the most important sense, exactly that woman, one floor down, doing the actual physical work the image only pretended to represent. And the distance between the two is not a flaw in how the era chose to remember itself. It is the entire point of what that era chose to remember at all. Picture, once more, the woman at the chrome and glass desk, the one taking dictation with a steady hand and a composed expression. The image this video opened with. You are looking at her differently now than you were 2.5 hours ago. You know things about her that the magazine cover never showed. You know about the room she came from before she reached that corner office, the room with 50 identical desks and a sound loud enough to leave ringing in her ears by lunch. You know about the physical force required to strike a manual typewriter key hard enough to punch through an original 3 layers of carbon thousands of times a day, and about the specific, quiet terror of a single mistake discovered on page 9 of a 12-page report. You know about the girdle beneath the skirt, the heels beneath the desk, is rarely permitted to remove, the supervisor's footsteps that every woman on every floor of every insurance company in the country learned to read like weather. You know about the hierarchy that used her skill without ever once naming it, and the quiet, unspoken solidarity that carried her through the days that hierarchy never made easy. You know that the glamour was real, in the sense that it happened, in the sense that some woman, somewhere, in some corner office, did occasionally live a version of that polished, cinematic moment. But you also know now that it was one frame taken from a much longer reel, and that the rest of the reel, the noise, the ache, the terror of the carbon copy, the girdle marks, the invisible vigilance behind a composed expression belonged to a great many more women than the single one the magazines chose to photograph. Think for a moment about what happened to all of this once the decade turned and the technology finally began to change. The electric typewriter spread through offices like Continental Mutual through the middle and later years of the decade, lightening the physical force required at the keys. Though the carbon copies remained for years longer still, and the noise, quieter but never silent, continued into the next generation of machines. The women who trained on manual typewriters carried the calluses and the muscle memory of that earlier machine with them regardless, a permanent physical inheritance from years spent striking keys that demanded far more of the hand than anything that came after. Carol will spend the back half of her career on quieter, gentler machines, and she will never quite lose the habit of striking harder than the newer keys actually require, an old reflex her hands hold on to long after the reason for it has quietly disappeared. Carol is not the figure in that opening image. She is the person the image was designed to hide. She is a mechanic and a proofreader and an editor and an athlete of sustained repetitive force and a diplomat navigating a hierarchy that never once asked her opinion. She performs all of it inside a single grey metal desk in row C for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, and she goes home afterward to an apartment she shares with her closest friend. And she counts an envelope of savings toward a wedding in the spring, and she falls asleep most nights before 9 o'clock, because there is simply nothing left in her body to keep her awake any later than that. She is not the figure in the painting. She is the person the painting was designed to hide. And she is magnificent, not despite the noise and the ache and the invisible vigilance, but in the very center of all of it, in the composed expression she holds through 8 straight hours of a room that never once stops asking something of her. Tomorrow she will pull the vinyl cover from her typewriter, roll a fresh sheet and 3 carbons into the machine, square the edges with 2 quick taps against the desk, and begin again. And she will do it the way she always does. Precisely, without a single visible sign of what it costs her. The office is dark now, wherever you are picturing it. The vinyl covers are on. The floor is finally completely quiet. Sleep well, friend.